Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Esoteric and a continuing series Castlevania Chronicles, where I review every single mainline Castlevania entry in the order they're released in a retrospective fashion. And the developers at Konami found a multiplier ×2 to go from 8 to 16 bits with Super Castlevania IV on the Super Nintendo. Before we get too far involved though, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like, subscribe, and that notification bell definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, we got a Patreon link down below as well. But when I say this game was a revelation upon its release, I am not kidding. This is leaps and bounds bigger and more interesting to look at than anything on the Nintendo Entertainment System. And that's not to knock the 8-bit generation, but when this game came out, nobody had seen anything quite like it before, and that's why it is fondly remembered as one of the best Castlevania games of all time. I'll tell you guys a little bit later where I would rank it personally, but it is an extremely good game that I have played a ton of throughout my life. Right off the top, with all the different effects, walking behind that fence there and the parallax scrolling, this is just a bigger version of Castlevania, and the developers see this as sort of a pseudo remake of the original game. Now, it doesn't feel that similar, and there's a ton of more mechanics like the whip, grapple, and swing here, but in certain parts you can see a direct design lineage between the first game and the fourth game, but it does so many new things that it is its own product. Now, for the first boss battle, I love this. I think it's Death riding in on a horse, but of course there's an actual death in Castlevania, so it's really kind of up to your imagination what they were going for here. But it is a quite easy first boss. You can just kind of wail on him and take the hits, tank him, and you'll be totally fine. Even with that one life bar left, I knew I was going to be safe. It's maybe not the best first boss for such an exciting game like Super Castlevania IV, but what is exciting is what Konami did with the Mode 7 graphical effect on the Super Nintendo. You could rotate background layers, and you're in this gigantic cylinder as it turns around you. And this goes as close to 3D as you're going to get in the home market for a pretty long time. But of course, if you can't tell, there is a graphical cost to this effect. And that is that the frame rate goes to a slideshow anytime anything like a skeleton is exploding on screen. It definitely looks incredible, and I appreciate that they did it. But at this point in the development, you really couldn't use Mode 7 to get that full frame rate out because nobody quite knew how to do it yet. But this is a ton of fun. One of my major things with this game, though, that's never made it go towards the very top of my list, is the color palette they chose. This looks interesting, the greens are green, the browns are brown, but everything kind of has this red hue. In some levels it looks really nice, and others I'm not too into it. But that is a completely subjective sort of thing. It makes sense when you're walking down this big mud wall here, but then you have those strange purple vines in the background. I would much rather look at the graphics of Rondo of Blood. This gameplay mechanically is extremely good, it just doesn't have the look. But when we go to a level like this, we have that dark overcast sky in the background with all those parallax layers and those more organic looking colors. This to me is what I wish more of the game kind of looked like. But I do love these little armadillo enemies you fight there, they're pretty cute. But doing something like this, going down this waterfall while these flying demons come in and the skeletons are trying to attack you and you need to manage your momentum, there's a weight to your player character that the original games did not have, and it feels so good to kind of fight against that current. It really makes you feel like you're in control of the character and any mistakes you make are down to your own. And in some instances, you can exit a stage and not even have a boss fight, and that's something that we really didn't see in the NES era either. And the map is always fun to see where you're going on your way to fight the big bad, of course, Dracula. And some things, even though they say this was a spiritual remake of the original NES game, this reminds me more of the cavern level on the Sharp X68000 version of Castlevania, which is also amazing. But let's knock some mudmen around here, shrink them down, and talk about the soundtrack. Go ahead and listen for like 45 seconds, and I'll come back and talk more about the game. Enjoy! I do love the soundtrack, but it is quite different than anything we had heard up until this point, because in a lot of spots it's quiet and brooding and dynamic. It has a certain vibe to it that you weren't used to hearing in a Castlevania game up until this point in time, and I really do enjoy that. It has a certain silence to it. There is music, but it's more of a tone, more of a vibe than it is some of the Castlevania tracks that you know and love, and I do like what they were doing there. But I will say it's a Castlevania game, and in some spots it's just going to juggle you, and it is going to be quite difficult. But unlike some of the NES games, the bosses are different, and maybe that's where in this game I think I take this down a tier compared to some of the games I'm going to put higher up in my personal hierarchy. This is a perfectly fine boss, but it's not really doing anything for me. It doesn't really 100% have that Castlevania vibe that I know and love. And leave me a comment down below and tell me why I'm wrong. I'm sure a lot of people love this boss. I think that's what it is. This is a great game that has every once in a while some strange color choices, but some of the boss characters just aren't that exciting. I enjoy more playing the stages until you fall through the floor like that. It makes you jump really quickly in spots than I do fighting most of the bosses. And usually in a Castlevania game, they're equal in my heart. But again, like I said, this is not going to be an easy game. Jumping, your whip mechanics, your patience and timing are all going to be something you need to actively manage, or else you're going to have a really bad time. And that's not what you want to do when you're playing a Castlevania game. But honestly, no one ever went into one of these games expecting it to be forgiving, and I would say that this is probably slightly easier than most entries on the Nintendo Entertainment System. But I mean, if you want to talk about a decent boss here, old Gene Simmons' skeleton with that tongue there, he's a fun one, and I really do like and appreciate what they did with that design. And you see some nice transparencies in that skull as well, and they left that checkerboard pattern in the back, not just to make it look interesting, they wanted to be able to see it from behind that skull. And moving on even more, an area of the game that I never enjoyed and to this day still think is a design flaw decision, and trust me, I don't make video games, so who am I to say what's a design flaw, is the rotating room. I've never liked this area. It just seems to slow the game down, and it seems to be put in specifically just to show that Mode 7 graphical effect. Where something like the Tetris level here, of course it's not Tetris, but it reminds me of it, does things with moving objects and rotation that the chamber that you just saw just don't do it for me. I love the rotating cylinder I showed in the middle of that hallway with that kind of oval curve to it, but the rotating hanging with the whip has just never been my favorite. But what is my favorite is this stage right here with these ghosts coming out of these treasure chests. I love it. It's one of my favorite bits of soundtrack in the entire game. So again, listen for 25 seconds and I'll come back and finish up this video on Super Castlevania IV. Enjoy! There's just something about the music in Super Castlevania IV that I've always gravitated towards, and I'm probably playing tracks for you guys that wouldn't be the ones that were most commonly associated with the game, but they're the ones I love the most about it. But of course it's a Castlevania game and you gotta have that clock tower, and if you get your whip power down you're gonna have a bad time. And that's always been a mechanic and almost always will, the 3-stage whip. But I do love that you can whip up in this game. It gives a much better sense of the combat and how everything kind of just moves around, because a lot of the enemies are above you at times. But every once in a while, the game's going to be a little cheap with jumps, let's just admit it. The controls in Castlevania are always a little bit iffy, it's by design. It's easier to wing swip across this chasm here and these chains than it is to get off that gear and jump up. But these whip mechanics here are so much better than the rotating chamber. I just love them that much more. But of course, it's not a Castlevania game without a Dracula fight, and it's not a Super Castlevania IV Dracula fight without jumping down here and cheesing them with all of these fun power-ups that they left for the fight. I love that they left this down here. Not many Castlevania games do that. Of course, you're always going to get a couple extra things before you fight Dracula, but this is just something that no one would ever think to jump down there, but it does exist, and it is there for you if you need it. And this looks so familiar. This is basically the same chamber as Rondo of Blood. It's going to be the same chamber at the beginning of Symphony of the Night. This concept of walking up those stairs and entering Dracula's own chamber is something that the franchise recycles in a good way time and time again, and I love that they do it. because it ties back to the concept that every 100 years, Dracula and his castle appear in the countryside. Now apparently in those 100 years, Dracula keeps meeting new architects and interior designers who change out the layout and decor of his castle, but honestly this chamber is I think one of his best with those windows that are boarded up there in the dark. And it's a good Dracula fight too. I wish he had a second form other than just kind of having his head turn into more of that menacing flare there. But the effects, the lightning bolts coming down, everything about it is a really classic Dracula fight. But I would say that this is probably one of the easiest Dracula fights around in the franchise. But I love how the sun comes through the window and burns him into a pile of bats. And there's just one last bat that has to go to the floor. That as a kid I thought you had to whip, but you really don't. But I still do it based on muscle memory. But yeah, that is Super Castlevania IV. It was a massive leap over the 8-bit stuff, but what it really did was get us into a generation where we'd start getting some of the things that everyone who didn't grow up with the NES remembers about Castlevania. But of course, it's not a Castlevania game without that dramatic look at the castle in the distance, crumbling. We will see you next week for the next video. Have a good day, guys. Bye-bye.